So you do not hold back about some of the enablers in Congress in your book at all. And when you were writing this book, Mike Johnson was not known by a lot of people, but now he certainly is, and I want to talk about him. But first, I want to spend some time talking about Kevin McCarthy, and I want to play some sound from an interview he did just this weekend.
Can he count on your support?
Yes.
That's an endorsement.
I will support the president. I will support President Trump.
Would you be willing to serve in a Trump cabinet?
In the right position. Look, if I'm the best person for the job, yes.
I mean, watching that, I was thinking, why? You're leaving Congress, so why?
Yeah. I mean, I can't explain it. It's pathetic. There's a sort of an element of it doesn't really matter what Donald Trump has done to the country, what Donald Trump has done to the Congress, what Donald Trump has done to Kevin McCarthy.
To him.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just kind of, going back for more. And I think it's sad, but I also think history is going to show that Kevin's unwillingness to do the right thing and, sort of each time that decision came, did real damage.
Yeah, I mean, unquestionably. You've said that Kevin McCarthy's successor, Mike Johnson, cannot remain Speaker through 2025. And we know the role from your book and from a lot of reporting that he played around January 6th as an enabler. You're very familiar with the power of the speakership. So break down for us, what could he do?
Yeah.
Why is that so concerning?
Well, the new Congress will be sworn in on January 3rd. And then on January 6th, 2025, the joint session will happen where the electoral votes are counted. And being in a situation where you have a Speaker of the House who's already shown that he's, willing to do things he knows to be wrong in order to placate Donald Trump, presents a real risk. And especially if you begin to think about what does it mean potentially if no candidate gets 270, if the election is thrown into the House, if you're in a situation where the Speaker can give more leeway to people who want to make objections, can make that easier to do. There are a whole series of things where we could find ourselves depending upon a majority, depending upon a Speaker who has already demonstrated he won't stand up against Donald Trump.
You've also said that he's smarter than Kevin McCarthy, which maybe is a compliment, except to me it's a little scarier. I mean, is he more dangerous?
I found Mike, and I say this, with sadness because he was a friend of mine.
Yeah.
But I found his role was very destructive because he's an attorney and because he portrayed himself to the conference as a constitutional lawyer. And so he would make assertions that had no basis in the Constitution, no basis in law, that were factually inaccurate. But then he would, sort of do that by claiming he was a constitutional lawyer, and he was able to get people to listen to him. He also, was just very duplicitous in terms of dealing with issues of very significant and grave importance.
And that could be a big risk coming up if he's still the Speaker. I also wanted to ask you about Mitch McConnell, because you clearly admire him, have known him for a long time. And you also expressed in your book some disappointment with moments where he didn't stand up for democracy. Do you worry that if Trump is reelected, Mitch McConnell would, despite his personal feelings, which I think everybody can guess, would also not stand up and not prevent some of these authoritarian tendencies we're seeing?
I certainly would like to hope that he will. And, as I write in the book about the fact that I've known him for decades, and I think even his political opponents in Washington have respected the way that, he has been able to maintain his leadership of the Republicans and sort of the master operator. But his political judgment, he made, big mistakes that matter a lot when he voted not to convict. It was also, I think, a tragic mistake when he would not support the effort to bring the Senate back into session so that trial could begin more quickly. If the Senate Republicans were going to decide that Trump being out of office meant that he could not be convicted, then they should have had the trial sooner. And I think in both of those cases, and I again, with great respect for Mitch, I think his assessment all along was Trump will go away. you know, and I think he thought maybe the impeachment vote in the House was enough. And certainly Trump has to be defeated. He's not just going to go away.
Well, and if he were to be reelected, he certainly wouldn't have gone away.
Right.
So he will be in a position where he'll have to make a decision.
Yeah, and I think not just Mitch, but there are many Republicans now who say, well, we know the danger, but then the next question is, would you vote for him if he were the nominee? And people need to recognize that suggesting you would vote for him after seeing what he had done, you know, is really indefensible.
I want to ask you about physical safety because you talk in your book about threats you received and threats your family also received. Nothing comparable to you, but I've received threats as a mom, names of my kids, home address. Are you still receiving a large number of threats?
Certainly, they still come. I think that, you know, a couple of things about these threats that people, you know, need to focus on. One is certainly, you know, to be in a situation where the threats are coming because of the actions of a former president of the United States is unprecedented. We also saw in Congress, and myself personally, the connection between when Tucker Carlson would say something on Fox about me personally or about another member, you would see the threats go up almost immediately. And that's, you know, something we called to the attention of the general counsel at Fox News when it happened. But it's something people really need to understand, the power of the lies that people are propagating.
One of the things that Trump has threatened or has been reported is that he will seek retribution. There's a threat of retribution, and that he will go after his enemies. Are you worried you're going to be on that list?
I don't think about that because I think it's so important for the whole country, for the future of the country, for the future of our kids, that you know, he never get to that place. One of the really stark moments for me in the last couple of years was having dinner with my husband and my sons and looking at my sons and realizing, you know, maybe they won't be able to take for granted that we live in a country with a peaceful transfer of power. And that sort of sudden realization that, you know, we've all generations of Americans have known that wasn't something that you had to worry about. Now we do have to worry about it. And so I think making sure that we kind of pull back from that abyss is what I'm very much focused on.
Not worried about the enemies list.